Do you know the biggest difference between broke people and rich people? It's not about how much money they earn, it's about how much money they spend. And if you want to have any chance of reaching financial freedom, you need to save money on your biggest expenses. And for most people, that's housing. So I wanted to use this video to explain why housing is your most important expense, the 5 strategies I use to save over $10,000 per year on housing, including one strategy that you could use without even moving, and the huge mistake that most people make when they buy a house, which I call the growth trap. As a bonus, I'll even explain why I never plan to buy a house myself. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before I explain any of that, I need to explain why housing is your most important expense. And there are actually 2 reasons for this. And the first is obvious. The average American household spends $24,298 on housing, making it the largest expense for most families. Even the average single American, like me, spends $19,156 on housing, which is actually even crazier to me. I knew that there was no way I was going to be able to retire by 30 if I was spending $20,000 per year on housing. That's what I spend in an entire year, total. But the second reason that housing is your most important expense is that not only is it super expensive, it's also recurring. Most people pay their rent or pay off their mortgage every single month. And that's really important because that means if you can spend less money on housing, you'll be saving more money every single month. That's very powerful. If you can reduce your monthly housing expenses from $2,000 to $1,500, you'd be saving an extra $6,000 per year. Since you keep having to pay for housing, minimizing these expenses now can make an enormous difference over the long run. So now that you understand why housing is your most important expense, let me explain the 5 strategies I'm using to save over $10,000 per year on housing. And the first one matters a lot because one of the most important factors in determining how much you'll pay for housing, maybe the most important factor, is where you live. And this is a real problem for me because I live in one of the most expensive areas of the world. I live in Northern Virginia, not far from Washington, D.C. And let me show you how insanely expensive housing is here. The average house is going for over $1 million, and it's easy to find homes going for even more than that. So buying a house was not an option for me when I moved here. But it's not like renting is cheap either. Average rent where I am is almost $3,000 per month. That's almost $36,000 per year just for a place to live. There is no way I'd be retiring in my 20s if I was paying that much money for housing. But when I was doing my apartment shopping, I noticed something. The reason that most apartments were so expensive is because they were in luxury apartment buildings in city centers, right next to subway stations, restaurants, and clubs. But I really just don't need all of that. So by living just a few blocks away from the city center, I was seeing apartments for $1,000 less a month. And it's not like this is a huge inconvenience for me. I live right next to a bus stop, so I can get into the city center in just a few minutes whenever I want to. So by just living in a quieter neighborhood, I'm already saving about $10,000 per year. And this is just the first of 5 strategies I'm using to save a ton of money. Because in all of my apartment shopping, I noticed another powerful way to save money. Because it's not just about where you live, it's also about where you look. If you search for apartments in your area, you're probably going to see sites like apartments.com pop up. They will have a lot of really nice luxury apartments in the big apartment buildings, but they're also going to be extremely expensive. Finding even studio apartments for less than $2,000 a month was pretty rare. So if you want to have any hope of finding more reasonably priced apartments, I highly recommend that you check out sites like Craigslist. At least in my area, Craigslist has a much wider range of options. I saw some of the same luxury apartment buildings, but I also saw apartments in smaller buildings that weren't nearly as expensive. So it was only when I got over to Craigslist that I started seeing apartments in the $1,500 to $1,700 range. That's thousands more dollars in savings compared to the apartments that I was seeing. Instead of paying $2,900 for rent, I could be paying $1,500 for rent. That's almost $17,000 in savings every single year. And I know that some people are afraid to use sites like Craigslist because they're worried about being scammed. But personally, I've never had any issues with it. Just don't send money until you've seen the place and ideally meet the landlord first. There are a lot of great options on Craigslist and they could save you a ton of money. And using a site like Craigslist also enables the third way to save money, which might be the most powerful. Because the big sites like apartments.com assume that you want to be paying all of that rent yourself. But you know what makes it a lot easier to afford an apartment like that? have somebody else pay for it. So when I first started looking for apartments in my area, the very first thing I did was join a Facebook group which was designed to help renters, roommates, and landlords connect. This was the first time that I started to see apartments for under $1,500 a month. I even saw some apartments for under $1,000 a month. That's still super expensive compared to a lot of the places in the world, but remember, the average rent for this area was about 3 times more expensive than that. And the reason that some of these places were so much more affordable is it required living with roommates. But I was still in college at the time, so this didn't seem like a big issue. In college, I was sharing a bedroom with a roommate, and I was sharing 2 bathrooms with 12 other people in my house. Now I have a bedroom and a bathroom to myself, which means I only need to share the kitchen with 3 other people. If you ask me, that's totally worth saving hundreds of dollars per month. Now, I totally understand that not everyone wants to live with roommates, and depending on what stage of life you're in, it might not be realistic. And if it's not for you, that's totally fine. And if you use the other strategies I've talked about in this video, you'll still be able to save thousands of dollars per year. I just want to include this strategy because that's one of the reasons that I'll be able to retire in my 20s. And eventually, after a lot of apartment shopping, I found a room off of Craigslist that cost just $1,000 a month. It was still close to a bus stop, a grocery store, and a gym, and it's just a couple of miles from my office. Compared to the average rent in my area, I'm saving $1,900 every single month, or $22,800 every single year. That's a pretty insane amount of money to be saving on just one expense. If you saved just that amount of money per year, you would probably be able to retire early. But look, I said that I spend $1,000 a month on rent, but that's not actually true. I actually spend $880 on rent and then also utilities. And that brings us to another saving strategy. And what I love about this strategy is you might be able to use it even without moving. And to show you how important this is, let me tell you a story. Last August, my landlord sent me the utility bills, and we owed $100 more than usual. That's a pretty massive difference, and when I looked into it, that all came from our water bill. And when we dug into it, we realized that one of our toilets was leaking. So by spending just $15 to replace the handle, we cut our water bill by over $1,000 in the year. Of course, this isn't nearly as important as all of the other saving strategies in this video, but by taking just a few minutes to make sure that you aren't overpaying for your utilities, you could save a surprising amount of money. But there's one more saving strategy I use, although calling it a saving strategy might not be accurate, because in the long run, it could actually lose me money. Because even though I could afford to, I've decided not to buy a house. Now, there are a lot of reasons that I'm not buying a house. It's not just a financial decision. I'll explain those later. But I do think that, at least for me, I'll make more money by renting instead of buying. And let me show you why. If I wanted to buy a house in this area, even one of the cheaper condos, I'd be paying a lot more than $1,000 a month. The benefit of this is that I would actually own property, and if the value of that property increased, it could make me a lot of money. But by keeping my housing expenses as low as possible and just investing all of the extra, I'm hoping that I'll make even more money from the stock market. Whether that makes sense for you depends on where you live, future stock market returns, and how long you live in an area. So it is a gamble, but I'm counting on renting being the better option. But if you do decide to buy a house, you need to avoid a super common mistake that I see a lot of people make, which I call the growth trap. One of the reasons that I plan to rent at least until I retire early is I simply just can't buy a house that's as small as I want. The only option is to buy a house or a condo that's way bigger than what I really need. But the mistake that a lot of people make is they tell themselves,
well, this house is an investment, so I'm not really losing money.
but the problem is your house is not an investment. Your house is just a house. Unless you only bought your house so that you could resell it for a profit, your house is not an investment. But people use this logic to justify buying way more space than they need, which means their mortgage is way larger than it needs to be. But it also means they're paying more on taxes, insurance, maintenance, utilities, and all of the other costs that come with a house. Most people will put up with these extremely high expenses because they'll tell themselves that it's all an investment. But in reality, they're just spending more money than they need to. Your house might increase in value over time, but that doesn't mean that it's the best investment. That's why I'd much rather keep my expenses as low as possible and put all of the extra in the best investment possible. But that's just one of many reasons that I'm not buying a house. I made an entire video a while ago where I explain why renting instead of buying is making me richer, happier, and more free. So check it out next if you're not sure which is right for you.